welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our good friend and show host and author, Joseph Pearce, is here. His new book, Race with the Devil, a little bit different, published by St. Benedict Press, subtitled My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. Great to have you here, Joe.
Good to be back, Doug.
You know, it's interesting, too, because so many times you've talked about Belloc and Chesterton or C.S. Lewis or all these great Catholic writers, and even Solzhenitsyn you wrote a book about way back when. But this is autobiographical, but a lot of people would look and they'd say, there's that cherub-like face of Joe Pearce. He's always talking about these hobbits and these wonderful creatures. And it turns out he's a little more like Gollum or something. I don't know. What happened?
Well, hopefully I was a little bit more like Gollum in the past and not today. But yeah, I mean, I had a very, very bad past. I was a racist. I was a member of a white supremacist organization, a neo-Nazi. I was also very heavily involved with the Protestant extremists, anti-Catholic extremists in Northern Ireland during the troubles over there. So yeah, I was involved with the skinhead movement, and so yeah, I was a long, long way from Christ and his church in those days. And I think one thing about my story, it does show that nobody, literally nobody, is beyond the reach of Christ. The love of Christ can reach anybody, the most hardened and hate-filled of hearts.
Well, you say right in the beginning, a soul in solitary confinement. It was the darkest day of my life. I sat in a cell in London's Wormwood Scrubs prison. They have great names over there. On the second day of a 12-month prison sentence. In both cases, I was in prison for publishing material deemed likely to incite racial hatred, a hate crime under Britain's Race Relations Act. A member of the National Front, a white supremacist organization. You were the editor, so even then you had your inclination towards writing, but this was something called the Bulldog. And that, I guess, was a racial screed?
Yeah, it was the paper of the Young National Front, the youth movement of the neo-Nazi organization of which I was a member. I founded that magazine when I was only 16 years old. So if you could say that writing's in my blood, but my blood was bad in those days, and so therefore my writing, if you like, was full of negativity. And I did actually want to incite racial hatred. I wanted a race war. I basically thought that the only way that we were going to get a white supremacist Britain, a racist Britain, was to basically, we weren't going to get it through the ballot box. We'd have to do it through fomenting hatred and violence and a race war, and basically win that war and emerge as victors. So yeah, it was all part of a strategy to destroy Britain's multiracial society.
You said back then you consider yourself an idealistic fanatic, and I consider myself a political prisoner of an anti-British tyrannical state. Let me ask you, I mean, you dedicate this book, I believe it's to your dad, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning. And at the end of it, your dad actually became a convert too?
Yes.
Right, as well. So, but I mean, did this come from him? I mean, where did this whole white supremacist idea come from? Was that inculcated to you as a kid, basically? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it was. I mean, it was. I sort of learned it at my father's knee, but I also learned it during the wider culture. Many of my neighbours were also racist. It was part of the culture, working class culture, in which I grew up, and there were various reasons for it, but certainly a nostalgia towards the British Empire, and that England is a great nation and it's being ruined, but also the fact that, you know, that the neighbourhoods were changing, you know, that over a period of years, you know, from being an all-white neighbourhood, there'd be Pakistani immigrants and Caribbean immigrants, and that, if you like, I suppose, inevitable tensions that arise from that change of demographic.
Well, was it also something in a sense, because here you are in the British Empire, you're the subjects, and you have these colonies who you've subjugated. Now all of a sudden all these provincials are coming and changing the England that you knew and loved, right?
Absolutely. There was an implicit assumption, if you like, that the British were superior to other races, and therefore to allow them to come to our country as we saw it, and take over was seen by us as being criminal. But of course, you know, the irony is, as the British Empire went to their countries and took over, so you could actually see in the wider scheme of things, there's actually a poetic irony and a poetic symmetry in the fact that, you know, that our chickens came home to roost, if you like.
Now, you yourself, you talk about in the very beginning, you kind of flash back, you kind of give us a sense of where you kind of are now, and you say that this is much different than you were really the first time you went to prison, that a huge difference between the 20-year-old fanatic who had gone to prison 4 years early and the 24-year-old who now sat in utter desolation in a lonely cell less than 2 weeks before Christmas. What had changed in you?
Well, basically, between the 2 prison sentences, I had come across the writings of people such as G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and C.S. Lewis. And so I'd become attracted to the Catholic Church. Now, I was still messed up. I was still sort of nowhere near the full convert, but I was now intrigued by Catholicism. I had a desire for religious faith. I had a desire for a spiritual life, which I'd never had. I'd never prayed before, ever. And during that second day of my prison sentence, I first prayed. And that was the beginning of answers flooding in and healing flooding in. So if you want, proof of prayer's power, I see it in my own life, because once I started actually a conversation with God, the answers started happening.
He starts talking to you.
Exactly.
Whether you like it or not.
Right.
And what he has to say, you're not always thrilled about. One of the things that struck me, too, you mentioned about not praying. Here you were a member of the Protestant Loyalists of Northern Ireland. So, but they're Protestants. I mean, isn't the Church of Ireland, which was, you talk about how the Scots came over and they kind of put them in Northern Ireland to kind of settle the Irish down. So, I mean, isn't it a church? Why wouldn't you be very deeply involved with your church if you have a group? I mean, if there was a group called the Catholic Loyalists, I would assume they're practicing Catholics. Right.
Basically, in Northern Ireland was very tribal. It was a tribal conflict, and there was a Catholic tribe and a Protestant tribe. And you didn't have to believe in God. It was about which tribe were you a member of. So, I was an anti-Catholic Protestant, but I wasn't a Protestant in the sense of believing in Protestantism. I was a Protestant in the sense of being anti-Catholic. So I was defined by my negativity, by my hatred of the other, and not by any belief of my own. I was an agnostic. I wasn't an atheist, but I didn't really care about God. He was irrelevant to me.
He didn't have any impact on what was happening in your life here and now.
Exactly.
And he wasn't going to change the way the society
I didn't know whether he
changed.
existed. I didn't care whether he existed, and it didn't seem to matter.
And an impact, right?
Yeah.
Well, you said I went to Mass for the first time in Wormwood Scrubs prison and continued to go occasionally. And that's what you alluded to at the beginning. But it's not the first time you were in a Catholic church. You tell a story early in your life, right? Wasn't it a friend of yours invited you to come in and you visited the Catholic Church, which was basically down the block from your house, right?
Right. Grace moves in mysterious ways, because we had a Catholic church basically opposite our house. You could see it from our front door. And I was probably about 10. I mean, I was a child, and I had a friend, and she took an interest in the Catholic Church. Why? I have no idea. And so she took me to this inside the Catholic Church, and I just remembered feeling a real and definite presence, which I never felt whenever I've been to any of the Anglican churches for weddings or anything like that. And of course, I had no idea what the real presence was at the time, but there's no doubt at all there was a presence in the Catholic Church which was certainly not there in the Anglican churches I'd been to, and it's what Ronald Knox calls of Anglican churches the real absence, the absence of the Blessed Sacrament. And I obviously felt that presence even though I didn't know what it was.
Now, connecting you to your later writings, you kind of grew up in, at least in your early days, was more of the Shire-like experience, right? And then you moved, right?
Yeah, a very, very important change in my life was the move from the countryside. The first 12 years of my life, I lived in the countryside, a very idyllic, Shire-like existence, days of innocence and contentment. And then when I was 12, we moved to London, and to the east end of London, so a rough part of London. So it was really a baptism of fire. And of course, this happened exactly at the time when I'm entering adolescence. So I basically nosedived from there, from someone who was doing well at school and was fairly well adjusted, to someone who basically became a rebel, started playing truant from school, got myself in trouble, and of course got myself involved in extremist politics.
Now, one of the things you mentioned in here too is that that our unconsciously, my friends and I inherited a subliminal anti-Catholicism which manifested itself in an irrational fear of monks. How did that, I mean, did you see religious on the street and you'd walk on the other side, or what?
Unfortunately, we didn't see any religious on the streets, but monks sort of went Rasputin, mad monks.
Okay, that was the image I had.
It was a Gothic. It was sort of part of the anti-Catholic culture of England. There's there was something ominous and morbid and macabre about the religious life. Yeah, we were scared. We were scared of monks. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that struck me, and I'm an old movie buff, so I was Captain Blood with Errol Flynn. I always think of this as the Anglican version, such an English bias. But the Protestant defeated the Catholic King James at the Battle of the Boyne, and there's a famous scene in that where good King William's come to the throne. They've kicked out that pimple James, and everybody cheers. And so, in some ways, even in the United States, it was this kind of anti-Catholic foreign that And so that's what you were feeling, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically living under a lie, because King James II was the bona fide, genuine King of England, and what happened was a revolution. I mean, even the winners called it a revolution. They called it a glorious revolution, but basically the true king was overthrown by a usurper.
Yeah, William of Orange basically
William
came
of
over
Orange,
from the Netherlands.
and he was basically paid for by rich merchants who didn't want the Catholic Church getting power again in England.
Right. Now, you mentioned that you talk about your faith, and you say, my parents had a healthy, rambunctious, and Dickens-like love for Christmas, and you kind of relate to that, and you say a Christmas story, you talk about Ralphie and them opening everything up, and then you relate another less edifying parallel with a Christmas story, and I guess to Dickens to some degree, was the relative absence of Christ from our Christmas, because you have this great moral story, but you never really hear anything about Christ, right? Neither one of them.
You leave the baby out of the whole picture, which is the reason, of course, for Christmas is the birth of Christ. And that's, of course, very, very sad and tragic. But, I thank God for Dickens, because Dickens did, if you like, re-baptize the spirit of Christmas. And certainly the presence of Christ was subliminally present in Dickens, whether you can say it's present in any sense in the Christmas story. I suppose it would be more arguable. But yeah, so there's this irony. We loved Christmas. We loved the joy, the love of man, brotherhood of man, all that stuff that goes with Christmas. But you just left out the central aspect, the birth of Christ, the one who reconciles God to man.
Right, but without that core, how do you hold on to that ultimately?
Well, you don't. Drifts, that's the trouble. Problem, it drifts away, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about what did your dad do for a living?
He was a carpenter.
Okay.
My father used to joke, actually, that he's a carpenter. He said the only good one they strung up.
Up a long time ago, right? 33 AD.
33
you say
AD.
Another aspect of my father's life and personality that I have sought to emulate is his omnivorous love of knowledge. My father revered Shakespeare, a reverence that I have inherited.
Yeah, and basically, I do see that I have inherited my father's mantle in the sense that I'm an autodidact. I've taught myself. I love knowledge. I love books. And my father was like that. He left school at 14 because of the Second World War. He had no formal education after the age of 14, yet taught himself swathes of Shakespeare, swathes of great English poetry. He knew history back to front. He knew geography back to front. He taught himself German, a smattering of other languages. And this is a working class carpenter who left school at 14. So I think I learned how to learn in a non-formal way from my father, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
And you also say my father was anti-Semitic in much the same way that he was anti-Irish.
Yeah, I mean, there was this paradox, because he was an anti-Semite, an anti-Irish, and a racist, but it was an abstract thing. If you actually saw an Irishman, you'd have a beer with him. If you
I was going to say, you talk about how he had friends.
Yeah, I mean,
Catholics, right?
Because you work in the construction industry, my father did. He had many, many friends who were Irish.
Right.
And he would have drinks with them, get drunk with them. They were his friends, and yet he would be anti-Irish and anti-Catholic in an abstract sense, but in reality, he loved men. So, he might have hated certain groups in the abstract, but in reality, one-on-one, he loved everybody.
He didn't see them that way. He saw them as the person.
He saw them as
were.
persons,
right,
as people.
Right,
yeah.
Right. You say my naive criticism of Orwell's fable is less tenable because the allegory at the heart of the animal farm is far more applicable to the tyranny of the Soviet Union to which it alludes. What impact did understanding Animal Farm have to you?
Well, basically, Orwell was very important to me because, as a neo-Nazi, you idolize big government, and you think that big problems can be solved by big government. You just have to change laws, and everything will be okay. And of course, you realize that in George Orwell's works, 1984 and Animal Farm, that big government is always corrupt, always tyrannical. And it doesn't matter if the government calls itself communist or Nazi or progressive. Whatever it calls itself.
Well, let's always remember that Nazi means nationalist socialist.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, we talk about socialism,
right,
and the second bit is secondary, national, international. Right. Socialism means big government and the belief that you can solve big problems with big government, which has never been the case in human history. Big governments always turned out to be tyrannical. So I learned that lesson from Orwell, and that was valuable because once you learn that lesson, how can you be a Nazi? Once you realize that big government's problematic, then you start that whole idea starts to crumble.
Right, and yeah, you talk about Orwell, who he never quite got over his Marxist background, but but you also say, ironically, in talking about your dad, my racism did not prevent me either from befriending the only Pakistani boy in my class. And later on, now he had a religious conversion, didn't he?
Yeah, almost this one person is a metaphor for what's happened in England in the last 30 years. When we were schoolboys together, he was the first person to show me a pornographic magazine. He was very sort of secular, and we got on quite well. But then I met him about 30 years later in a tube station in London, and he recognized me. I didn't recognize him, but he introduced
Right, you talk about that in the book.
Yeah,
right,
he introduced himself to me, and he said that we're friends, and we have a lot in common now. And I thought, what can he mean? So I thought he was going to say, what happened to you? You know, you got involved in this racist group. He said, we got a lot in common. I thought, what's he talking about? He said, well, you know, you hate the Jews and we hate the Jews. I said, pardon? And he'd become an Islamic fundamentalist who hated Israel. And I thought, you know, what, you have this radical, you know, basically born the same time as me, I think born in London, you know, but Islamic parents, and he'd been radicalized. And he sort of really showed to me that how the multicultural experiment was unraveling into sort of ghettoized bigotry.
Now, you obviously were involved with what sounds like gang-like groups later, but you say, my father's chivalrous approach to fighting saved me from the desire to join gangs.
Yeah, I mean, I was always taught that you don't look for a fight and you stand on your own 2 feet, you stand by yourself. You know, Marquis of Queensberry rules, you don't kick a man when he's down, you know, you don't use weapons. So those things held me in good stead because, you know, I didn't want to run with gangs, I didn't want to carry a knife. I didn't want to kick someone when they were down. I didn't want to be part of a group of people kicking one person. That always struck me as being something sort of rather horrible. And so I thank God for that, because I could have been much, much worse than I was. I mean, just thank God for small mercies.
So you weren't a punk rocker or a teddy boy then? What's a teddy boy?
Well, I don't think teddy boys ever happened over here. Teddy boys are really a 1950s phenomenon. It was when American rock and roll, Elvis and such like, took off in England, and there's a youth cult. And they came back in the 70s, teddy boys, as and they were very against the punks, because teddy boys tended to be sort of, for want of a better word, right-wing and maybe racist, and punks were left-wing and anarchist. And they would fight each other on the street. But no, I was neither. I actually liked both types of music. I liked Elvis, rock and roll, and punk rock at the time. But you know, I never became a member of any youth cult, including skinheads. I ran with skinheads. Most of my best friends were skinheads, but I never had the haircut. Thanks be to God, I never got the tattoos. So, you know, again, thank God for small mercies.
Yeah, I think in the 60s, it was different. It was the mods and the rockers and things like that that were out there. Now, who's Nick Griffin, and what impact did he have on you? Nick
Griffin's the lead, these days, is the leader of the British National Party, which is a fairly major party in the United Kingdom. It believes in repatriating non-white immigrants. So he sort of stayed, if you like, in the politics that I was in those days. So my book sort of looks at my friendship with him as you know, and rather my sadness also that he hasn't, if you like, moved on from there to something more positive and more loving.
Now, you talk about his situation. You talk about even about Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, in a sense, people using his Selfish Gene book by Dawkins as a way to help substantiate their racial
ironic.
views.
You know, Richard Dawkins now is the darling of the neo-atheists, but he was actually the darling of the National Front, the darling of the neo-Nazi movement, because we thought that his book, The Selfish Gene, when it was published, was an intellectual justification for white racial supremacy and for racism itself. You know, the selfish gene, well, it was natural for those with genetic similarities, in other words, race, to want to stick with their own, and we used Richard Dawkins' arguments to justify that.
Now, you say in chapter 10, you say 3 novels and a real hero. What were the 3 novels, and who's the hero?
Yeah, the three novels were Camp of the Saints, which actually is a great novel literarily, but was racist, written by Frenchman Jean Raspail. The Turner Diaries, which was a vicious racist novel about a race war in the United States, really, really nasty novel. And the good one was a good one, 1984, I'm trying to remember.
Yes, 1984.
Oh, thank you. It's like being tested on my own book.
That's
this
right,
is great.
that's right.
Well,
it was the second Orwell book you mentioned earlier, which was really about 1948, but that's okay.
Right, but 1984, again, as I said, that was the one that had the good influence, because that showed me the dangers of big government. The other two had negative influences.
Right. How did you start to change? I mean, what was it that made you start to think? Because you mentioned about reading one of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then, you know, heard maybe there was a forgery. So was there something and maybe did you have an advantage because you did have this literary background? You had the Shakespeare to thy own self be true kind of a thing, that you were maybe a little more well-read and could see some of these things that other people paid no attention to, that maybe didn't jive with how you were living your life?
Absolutely. I think to the extent that we understand the wisdom of the ages, the extent that we're steeped in the heritage of Western civilizations, the more we can judge the present day objectively. And I think I did genuinely desire truth. So I was uncomfortable when I knew that our side were lying. If our side are lying, or our side are building their intellectual position on something which is a forgery, well, that's problematic, you know. So that undermines some of my belief in the ideology. But the other thing that I think was very practical, I talk about in the book, is when I found genuine love. Genuine love was shown to me by my enemies. Because for me, you know, one of the things that I was taught growing up is you don't die for your country, your enemy dies for your country. So this sort of very sort of bigoted sort of view of patriotism. But I had various enemies, you know, a punk rocker whose views were opposed to mine, a Jewish lawyer who was a libertarian who was obviously opposed to my views, a policeman, and each of those showed me love. And receiving love from an enemy, you can't argue with it. Ultimately, the way you convert people is to actually become holy. I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but in the presence of sanctity, in the presence of love, all of our prejudices are disarmed. And looking back now, I see how those acts of love by people who are my enemies had a very significant healing effect upon me.
And just kind of broke down the wall that you had set up probably for yourself.
Exactly.
Now, Chelsea, that's your football club?
It still is, yes.
And so...
I'm wearing a Chelsea tie as we speak,
okay. And
actually,
were you considered a hooligan? I mean, did you go to games and fight?
Yes, I did in the mid-70s, but I was 14 and 15 at that time, so that I wasn't one of the big boys, so I ran with the pack, really. You know, one of the leaders of the hooligan group. By the time I was old enough to, if you like, to have become one of the leaders, I'd got more involved with politics and sort of led, you know, the Young National Front, which might have been the largest gang in the country at the time, but wasn't allied to any one particular team.
Right.
But yes, I had my hooligan period.
Now you also have your music period. You had a kind of eclectic. You mentioned some of the music. You also talk about Glenn Miller and thing here. Now you talk about is it Soft Cell and your brother. Now you guys weren't doing so, but your brother made a lot of money in the music business. Didn't he?
Ironically, for two boys born in the East End of London from working class parents, we both sort of in various ways have done rather you know, what you wouldn't expect. So my brother became a millionaire at the age of 18 because he was the manager of Soft Cell, a group that had the largest hit in the world in 1981.
Tainted Love, right?
Tainted Love,
right,
yeah.
sure.
And he was the manager of Soft Cell and also the owner of the record label. So he actually earned more than they did because he got his cut as manager and his cut as the record company owner. So yes, and obviously then we became more estranged because of that. He followed the rock star lifestyle with all that entails, the hedonism, and I was the sort of the revolutionary. So that sort of put the nail in the coffin of our should we say filial relationship.
So is that still where it is today, or?
Sadly, largely,
right,
yes.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you say, I sometimes quip that most of my friends are dead, but are nonetheless the most delightful and the liveliest of company, which is why solitary confinement didn't bother you.
Yeah, I mean, I said most of my friends are dead because most of my friends are some of these giants of civilization. So, you know, Dante and Shakespeare and Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, you know, these great writers, yeah, they're dead in one sense, but their words are very much alive, their ideas are very much alive, their love is very much alive, and it's alive in such a way that it actually passes on to the living. So it can make us more alive also through the reading of it. So I really, if it wasn't for them, God knows where I'll be now.
Now you also, when you were in prison, there was the Free Joe Pearce campaign. There was also an album on the other side called Gas Joe Pearce. So you had people on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a punk rock group called the Electro Hippies that brought out a track called Gas Joe Pearce. I was amused by it at the time. I'm still amused by it now, actually. Yeah.
Gregor Stress and Otto Stresser. You talk about the Nazis, and you've got Barry Maguire and Eve of Destruction, and then you end up with Chesterton. You started reading Chesterton when you were incarcerated?
Actually, I read.
Or you read more of it?
I read Chesterton first of all before I was incarcerated, and I fell in love with Chesterton in spite of my own will, if you like. In fact, what I do in the book, I quote my first relationship with my first reading of Chesterton with C.S. Lewis's, because we were very much the same. He was an atheist when he first read Chesterton, but couldn't help liking Chesterton. I was a racist, agnostic, but couldn't help liking Chesterton. Both of us read more and more Chesterton, and in consequence, we moved closer and closer to Christianity, and in my case, of course, closer and closer to the Catholic Church.
Right, and you talk about your private life. There's some information in here that's new and different. People can find out about it when they read the book, and even talk about, I thought it's interesting because in other books you've written about Chesterton, you have your anti-Catholicism because of the Irish background and how you overcame that. It seems like he didn't quite do that.
No, well, to be fair to C.S. Lewis, he was born in Belfast, and if anybody's experienced Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Belfast is one of the most sectarian cities in the whole world. And if you're born on one side of the religious divide, it's very, very difficult to cross it. And Lewis never managed to cross it. So I was involved in the politics over there, but I was born in London.
So it was somewhat, gave you an advantage.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Joseph Pearce. We're happy that, like St. Paul, hopefully you'll finish the race with the Devil, and it's published by St. Benedict Press. My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. Very interesting read, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.